Once again, our speaker this afternoon, I think is probably well known to many of you, Doron Swade, formerly of the Science Museum, and his title for this afternoon, The Shocking Truth About Charles Babbage and His Calculating Engines, which sounds like something more akin to the Daily Mirror or whatever passed at that time for the shocking media. We ought perhaps, in welcoming Doron once again to our meetings, to offer him congratulations on being awarded a PhD for basically the work that he's going to present this afternoon, although he was just telling me as we were chatting beforehand that he promises these are the interesting bits. All sorts of things are left on the cutting room floor of the Viva. So that's this afternoon's meeting. Could I just remind you, first of all, the next meeting we are planning is on January 22nd to mark the 20th anniversary of the Apple Mac. And then on the 26th of February, we have an afternoon of presentations concerned with payroll on computers, looking at a number of different early payroll systems and the way that payroll evolved. And so, without further ado, I think I see a microphone being put on. But without further ado, let me hand over to Dr. Doron Swade.
Thanks very much, Roger. Do I need a mic, or is it okay out there? Yes?
Mic would be preferable.
Mic is preferable. Excuse me. Right, I was originally asked to give an update on difference engine number 2. Many of you may be familiar with the fact that the first Babbage difference engine was built here at the museum, and things have gone quiet for some while, and I think it was Hamish who suggested that maybe it's an appropriate thing for the CCS to bring people up to date about what had happened. So that's part of what I'm going to do. But also, I'd like to present a rather broader perspective of some new work that has been done on Babbage studies and the origin of the title of this thing, The Shocking Truth About Charles Babbage's Engine. Now, whether or not you find what I'm going to say shocking depends very much on how easily you are shocked. So I should say right at the outset that I have no new revelations about a torrid affair between Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage, for which there is absolutely no new evidence. I have no great thesis that Babbage's collected works were written either by Shakespeare, by Francis Bacon, or by Christopher Marlowe, and I have nothing to say about the state of Denmark. But nonetheless, despite those cautionary introduction, the new work does quite radically provide a revisionist account of some of our major perceptions about Babbage and his motives for building the engines in the first place. So it's slightly in the crack. So if you like, there are two completely different discourses going on here. There's a kind of historical and historiographic discourse, examining where do our perceptions of Babbage come from, why do we tell the tale the way we do, and what is the origin of our received perceptions about Babbage. We're going to dig a bit into that. And also provide an update on what's actually happened since 1991, which is the calculating section of the engine was built, and what work has been done since. So, Babbage is equally famous for two things, as is well known. He invented computers and he failed to build them. And we tell and retell the story of his failures, looking for lessons for modern times, for parables, about entrepreneurs, about relationships to government advice, about the relationship of an entrepreneur to the establishment, and these various other things that we try and sift history for modern instruction. But if we look at how it is, our perceptions of Babbage, why do we tell the tale the way we do? How were our perceptions, our historical perceptions, framed then something quite intriguing emerges. That's Babbage, date of birth 1791, died in 1871. That's when Babbage was in his late 50s, right by the time he was designing Difference Engine number 2. We find when we look at where our received perceptions of Babbage come from, that they all converge on 5 primary contemporary 19th century texts. If we just strip out where the skeleton of the story comes from, we can identify 5 specific texts. Firstly, there's a dauntingly long paper by Dionysius Lardner published in Edinburgh in 1834. This is the most extensive contemporary account of Babbage's enterprise. This was 1 year after the collapse of the project. That is to say, the project was now dead after 10 years after Clement walked out. We'll come back to that presently. The second main text is a statement drawn up by Sir Harris Nicholas in 1843, which recounts the tale from 1821, the inspired conception of tabulating by machinery, until the collapse of the project, the government withdrawal, final financial withdrawal in 1842. 20 decades accounted by Sir Harris Nicholas. The third one is a statement by Babbage himself, published anonymously in the Philosophical Magazine, where he airs his grievances and again makes his case for why he was badly dealt with and so on. Then there's the official History of the Royal Society, chapter 11, 1849, is devoted entirely to Babbage and the saga of his engines. And finally, there's the Buxton manuscript, not published till the late 1980s, written immediately after Babbage's death by a colleague. Now, the point about all these texts is that they are all based on material provided by Babbage himself. They're all based on the same sources, the correspondence, the letters, and Babbage's own recollections and annotations. And there is explicit evidence for the fact that this is the case. Babbage collaborated very closely with Lardner over the production of his article. The statement drawn up by Harris Nicholas declares as a measure of the authenticity of his findings that they were based on sources provided by Babbage. This was not regarded as something that in any way compromised the objectivity of his findings. Quite the reverse, it was regarded as something that could therefore be relied on precisely because it was based on authentic documents. The Babbage's one clearly is based on his own views. Weld's theory, actually there's correspondence to indicate that Weld, out of huge respect for Babbage, invited Babbage to comment on the drafts of his chapter and actually pays a tribute in his chapter to Babbage for providing original sources. And finally, the Buxton manuscripts are actually based on manuscripts given by Babbage to Buxton. The upshot of all this is that Babbage, if you like, was his own historian. The received perceptions of the entire Babbage story was written by Babbage. And if we begin to now, say, take Babbage off the podium, I mean, Babbage had a voice loud and strong to begin with, and this is amplified by history, if you like, who seems to have a soft spot for thought of geniuses and men ahead of their time, unquote, which I implore anyone present never to use that phrase. History seems to have a soft spot for thought of geniuses, for people who had to fight the apparent stupidity of others to achieve some dream, which then becomes justified by subsequent events. And as a result of which, the entire canon of Babbage studies has effectively been dominated by sources accumulated and provided by Babbage himself. So that is, what of laying that out that way is, in a sense, what is clear what I will next do is actually, if you put that aside and remove Babbage from the podium and listen to what others had to say, including his durable antagonists, then we can actually perhaps produce a more balanced picture. And the shocking truths, if you like, insofar as they are shocking at all, will be the extent to which we now have to revise our perceptions of what it was Babbage was doing, quite apart from the circumstances in which he did it. So if I were to isolate if we just take what the bare bones of all those accounts provide, and this is doing it as factually insofar as a fact is a problematic historiographic entity anyway, but firstly, the inspired conception in 1821, when Babbage was checking tables with Herschel and dismayed by the errors, this is the famous vignette, dismayed by the errors, he says, "I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam." This is Babbage's mechanical epiphany. 1822, he meets with the Chancellor, John Robinson, and leaves the meeting, which was unminuted, with a clear understanding, and he's quite consistent in his insistence of this understanding, that the government had committed to fund the engines to completion. There was no delivery date, there was no budget, there was nothing but. He left with a clear notion that the government had made this undertaking. 1832 is the next big event, a decade of design and development, of huge expenditure. Joseph Clement, his engineer, walks out, downs tools, abandons the project, following a dispute relating to compensation for moving his workshop. The detail of the dispute doesn't matter, but so we have inspired conception, government funding, a decade of development, Clement walks out, and in 1842, that's 20 years after the first conception of the machine, the government finally withdraws and government funding, and the project is abandoned. So in those 20 years, the project went from inspired conception to complete collapse. Now, all the accounts are reinforce and present those essential features of the thing. So I want to identify two particular received perceptions. Firstly, Babbage's historical image, that Babbage was a genius surrounded by fools, and I will elaborate on that. And secondly, the role of errors. The fact that in all the tales we tell, including ones I have told, that the role of errors as both the jumping off point and the enduring motive for his continued activities, that errors played a principal and continuing part. So we will come to examine those things. Now, even though the four of the five accounts are not by Babbage's hand, it is clear that they come from the same stable. The repetition of particular phrases, the similarity in the rhetorical position he adopts, makes it clear that those 5 accounts come from the same stable. He then further blurs the issue of authorship by republishing 2 of the accounts by other people in works of his own. Again, it's his voice. He's saying, these are things, these are my perceptions about how my experiences, and this is how I choose to frame them. So again, there's a blurring of actually who is telling us what here. Again, it's Babbage's voice, even though there is the external appearance, if you like, of independence, of autonomy of these independent accounts. Now, the subtext of Babbage's self-portrayal is that of a wronged genius. He writes that he regards the government's final withdrawal in 1842 as a betrayal of the original commitment by John Robinson to fund the engines. The grievances about lack of honours, lack of recognition from his peers is a running motif in all his writings. This is an aggrieved man who feels that he was not, the honours and the recognition for his work was not appropriately conferred. The villain of Babbage's account is George Biddle Airy, Astronomer Royal, who dominated civil science from 1835 for the next 46 years. Airy is portrayed by Babbage as someone who bore him malice through professional jealousy, who was a pragmatist, who was mediocre in his conception and his ability to envision the future of computers, and this is the received perception of Airy. Now, historians since have colluded in this perception of Airy and of Babbage, and it's particularly worth perhaps noting Anthony Hyman's biography, a very influential biography, the first really authoritative biography of Babbage, published in 1982. Now, Hyman colludes with Babbage as the wronged genius. This is Babbage surrounded by fools. He refers to Robert Peel, the Prime Minister, who Babbage stormed out of the meeting of and then effectively wrecked any possibility of future funding. He refers to Peel as someone who was scientifically literate, upon whom the bounty of science and invention was lost, as someone who didn't appreciate engines and science. He calls Henry Goulburn, that's Peel's chancellor, a mediocrity, and Dionysius Lardner, this prolific popularizer of science, a gifted and talented lecturer, refers to him as a clown, a scientific Falstaff, even now occasionally mistaken for a serious figure. He continues, Lardner was the comedy act of the show. He ballooned across the engineering landscape, sustained by an inexhaustible supply of hot air. So we have Hyman, if you like, colluding with Babbage in Babbage's self-perception of himself as a thought genius. Somebody who failed as a result of the stupidity of others. Inventor as hero. Now, the astonishing success of the modern computer makes it difficult for us not to view people who did not see the potential in those days and did not appreciate the possibilities as acts of stupidity. But we really must be very, very careful in historiographic terms about backwards projection. In Babbage's time, these things were unknown. They were using criteria that had nothing to do with the kinds of things we now know computers are capable of. So those are the two particular images of the inherited tale that I will come back to. That is Babbage's historical image. Was he surrounded by fools? To what extent were the people who did comment on his machines qualified to do so? To what extent were they right, insofar as right is a legitimate concept to use in this kind of analysis? And then there's the question of the role of errors, which is actually perhaps the major element in which one would need to revise. Right, what I'm going to do now is leave the issue of this rather the richer historical context and go from the sublime to the ridiculous in a sense and look very specifically at difference engine 2. And so there is inevitable kind of disruption here, and this is quite inevitable. It appears to be a disruption because it actually is. The best way I can justify looking at difference engine 2, apart from the fact that may be of inherent interest, is that the physical appearance of the machine, for those who have seen it and perhaps those who have not, conveys more effectively than perhaps language can what was at stake in the engine debates. This was not backroom science. This was a massive capital risk. Government spent £17,500, which I estimate in modern terms, reliable and unreliable as these estimates are, to be something like £90 million, and they got nothing for it. This was an issue of huge public interest. It would have altered the employment patterns, the skill set, and disrupted the existing and established control of resources. So there was a huge investment in established practice. And the engines firstly threatened them. Secondly, they were a huge capital investment. Secondly, massive risk. And perhaps the physical scale of the machine and its intricacy conveys in ways that language struggles to do just how monumental the engine enterprise was in Babbage's day. This is a de Colmar thermometer, late 19th century, which was, okay, the Colmar thermometer is well known, was introduced in 1820 by Thomas de Colmar, and is billed usually as the first successful commercial manual calculator. The point is that this device took well over 50 years to mature. It wasn't until the 1880s, that's after Babbage was dead, long after the engine debates were absolutely dead and buried. It took till the 1880s for this device to sell in any appreciable numbers at all. In Babbage's time, in 1820, 1821, during the 1820s, this was an unreliable device. It was noisy, it was susceptible to failure, it was unsuitable to daily use, and had 6 to 8 digits. It was not a realistic competitor. More than anything, it was manual. That is, it relied on the informed intervention of a human operator to get any results out of it. You had to operate the dials, you had to turn the handle, you had to write down the results, and all the rest of it. The point about Babbage's engines were that they were both a monumental quantum leap, both in physical scale and in intellectual and logical conception. There was nothing like it. Firstly, the machines were automatic. That is to say, they embodied for the first time mathematical rule in mechanism. You cranked the handle, and you got results which up to that point in time you could only get by thinking. You did not need to understand the principle of the machine or the mechanics of how it worked in order to get useful results. Now you cannot overemphasize the importance of that fundamental concept of embodying what was hitherto intelligence in machinery. You could not have computing until you had automatic machines. So the progression from mechanized arithmetic to fully fledged computation had as its first step automation. So in 1821, when Babbage conceived of these machines, it was a fundamental, monumental leap, not only in logical conception, but in physical scale. That device weighs a few pounds, it fits on a table. Babbage's difference engine number 1, estimated would have weighed 10 tons. It consisted of 25,000 parts. It was so heavy it ran on railway tracks. So this again is a way, if you like, the value of a physical artifact in conveying just what was at stake here. So that's Babbage's difference engine number 1. That's 1/7 of the machine. That's perhaps the most celebrated icon in the pre-instrument. First successful automatic calculating device. You turn the handle on the top, and you turn that handle up there, and you get. And once the machine is set up, the difference engine works on it to find differences. You get results which you can read off, and the person reading the results off does not need to understand the principle of finite differences, nor the mechanism. So this is an absolutely fundamental step. This is Babbage demonstrating his theory of miracles to Ada Lovelace and her escort, and this is the Duchess of Somerset. This photograph I took with a digital camera in 1830. It's a bit blurred because technology then was a bit agricultural. This actually is a scene from the Great Inventor series, which will be out on the Babbage's episode of that is coming out in January, and this was actually filmed in this room using the first difference engine, set up actually to produce the theory of miracles. So you'll be able to see a reenactment, a docudrama of the dramatized version of Babbage demonstrating theory, using programmed discontinuity to show that miracles in nature were in fact law-like. You did not need a deity, a godlike agent, to produce phenomena for which there was no physical account. You could actually account for discontinuities through programmed discontinuities. So that's just an aside and a digression. This is Babbage's difference engine number 2 as it presently stands in the gallery. Right. It's operated, it was designed between 1847 and 1849. It consists of a total of 8,000 parts. There are 4,000 parts in the calculating section and 4,000 parts in the printing section. It's operated by cranking a handle, and it's 11 foot long and 7 foot high. It calculates and tabulates any 7th order polynomial to 31 decimal places. So it will take any equation of the form y equals ax to the 7 plus bx to the 6 and so on all the way down, plus a constant, coefficients positive and negative. One of the pleasures of talking to an audience like this, you can actually talk dirty. Most of the time you've actually got to say things in general historical terms, most of which are irrelevant a week later. But, so that's what the machine does. It does it by method of finite differences. What the machine does, the value of the method of finite differences, perhaps well known, is that it eliminates the need for multiplication, division, subtraction, and addition, which would normally be needed to find the value of any given function, and allows you to do that using repeated addition only. And addition can be executed without too much difficulty using pure gear wheels. So what the machine does is add, so the tabular result appears on column 8, which is at the end there. Numbers are represented by figure wheels, which I'll show you examples of. Units, tens, hundreds, thousands, going up all the way to the top, 31 digits. So a 31-digit number is held in decimal digital form on each of these columns. This is the 7th difference column, 6th difference, 5th, and so on, tabular value. So what the machine does is add the 31-digit number in that column to a 31-digit number in that column, so on, so on, so on, and the tabular value ends up on that column over there. This device, which we will talk about in detail, because that's effectively what the update is. Now, this section of the engine, I'll show you. This is one of the design drawings, one of 20, which is perhaps evocative, most evocative of its overall shape. There's a crank handle, there's a cam stack, there are the columns and figure wheels, that's the printing section. And the whole thing is driven, the printing section is driven by a huge shaft which runs on the other side of the engine, driven by that crank handle. So that's effectively what the machine does. It weighs about 5 tons, so it's not portable, and it doesn't run Windows. Numbers are stored and operated on figure wheels, so it's a decimal digital machine. It's decimal in the obvious sense that it identifies 10 distinct states, the numbers 0 to 9. It's digital in the sense that only discrete values of integers are recognized as valid representations of digit values. So if you want to represent 2.5, it's not a wheel sitting between 2 and 3. That is in an indeterminate position and is invalid. 2.5 is represented by a 5 in the units wheel and a 2 in the tens wheel. So every digit has its own figure wheel, and in that sense it is digital. But it's digital in a much more profound sense, and that is, okay. What we talk about digital now is borrowed from electronics. Well, it isn't, but the idea of a flip-flop, the idea is that the transitional states between the binary states are not stable. Flip-flop, because of positive feedback, once the threshold is exceeded, flips into its other state. The transitional states are not stable. Now, the point about a figure wheel is that the transitional states are stable. That figure wheel can actually occupy any of the intermediate positions between 2 and 3. So what additionally makes it digital is the control system, which actually detects whether a wheel is in an indeterminate position. And we can see very early examples of attempts that Babbage made. Okay, I'm going to break there and come back to that when we look at, right, okay, just put that aside. If we look at the engines in general, it has been said many times that that Babbage's engines incorporate in very explicit detailed terms many of the logical features of modern computers. Okay. What I want to look at is the extent to which that is true, and I want to say one of the pleasures of talking to an audience of this kind is actually, probably for the first time, we can now start looking at the mechanical equivalent, not of heat, but of the mechanical equivalent, a lot of the logical functions we now accept as being actually modern and electronic. And these are some of them. Different engines incorporate, in explicit design terms, the following functions we would now recognize as part of modern computing. Firstly, microprogramming. Secondly, pipelining. Thirdly, pulse shaping. Thirdly, binary latching. And finally, polling. These are all there, and I'll give you examples of them. In the analytical engines, we have programmability using punch cards. We have the separation of store and mill, which is the famous, the classic von Neumann architecture, the clear distinction between store and mill. These are physically separate devices. The machine is capable of conditional branching, of looping. It is iterating the same sequence of operations a predetermined and programmable number of times, and a parallel processing, that is to say, to reduce the total time for a particular process by sharing it between distributed processes. So all those are actually explicit in the detailed designs. Right. I will catch up to the question of the digitalization presently, because there's an illustration of Babbage's early attempts to do that. Okay, so let's see what this one is. Right. Okay, this is the engine as it presently stands. By 1991, which is the bicentenary of Babbage's birth, we'd finished the entire calculating section. The printing and stereotyping operation hadn't existed. And what I'll do is concentrate less on the calculating section. The upshot of the calculating section, apart from identifying these modern features, is actually that the upshot of the whole palaver of what that device does is produce a 31-digit result on that column. And primarily what we'll be looking at now, since we've spoken at length on earlier occasions about the calculating side, is to look at the stereotyping and printing apparatus. But first what I'll do is actually run the machine for those who might not have seen it, or for those who have seen it, but not lately. Cranking a handle, that's like a macro instruction. It says calculate and tabulate the next value in the table. This, if you like, is a microprogram. It automatically translates the macro instruction and automatically executes all the finer instructions that allow it to provide the lifting, turning, and sliding motions necessary to form the method of finite differences. Here we can see the cam stack. It's a set of 14 conjugate cams. They're geometrical inversions of each other, so the machine is driven positively upwards and dragged downwards. It does not rely on gravity. The idea is you can run it quite fast. So these are cam followers which are producing these. So there are 14 cams, 28 in all, and each one is a geometric inverter. So it's driven upwards and does not rely on gravity to be pulled down. So that, if you like, is a multi-program microprogram. That's just to reorient ourselves. We now look at the calculating wheels. Now you can see there's a shifting motion. We'll see that more clearly now. It's quite difficult to discern by eye, but you can see that, that what's actually happening is that columns 1, 3, 5, and 7. I'm going to stop that there. I mentioned that pipelining, that is the preparation of a result ahead of its need. Now what's going on here is, what the machine needs to do is add a 31-digit number on that column to a 31-digit in that column. There are 8 columns altogether. So if it's adding a number on one column to another, there are only 2 columns out of 8 that are being used at any one time. So 75% of the machine is very inefficient. Only 25% of the machine is being used. Now what Babbage did was, he actually split the cycle. In the first half cycle, columns 1, 3, 5, and 7 add their contents to columns 2, 4, 6, and 8. In the second half cycle, columns 2, 4, 6, and 8 add them. Now, provided you offset the initial value settings, this actually produces the same results. Very easy to see when one does a manual table from there. The upshot of that is that the whole engine is being used all the time, or at least half the engine is being used at any given time. But also, the cycle time does not depend on the number of differences. You can have 14 differences here, and the cycle time for 14 differences would be exactly the same cycle time as 7. So it's not, the time overhead is not scaled by the number of differences of the size of the machine. So that would be equivalent to pipelining. The result is prepared ahead of its need. And that shifting motion you see is 1, 3, 5, and 7 working together, and 2, 4, 6, and 8 working in the second half cycle. So these are the figure wheels running.
Where are
I'll show you some techniques that Babbage used to cater for wear. But you can see that shifting. That shifting is the half cycle operation. And that's the successive carrying method. That's a system of polling. Each of those levers, as it turns, is polling a latch, which I will describe later, to see whether a carriage is needed in the next decade. So that's binary latching, polling, and conditional branching, in fact, all in one. And I'll describe that mechanism shortly. Okay, so that's roughly what the engine looks like, and again, you know, the spectacle of it actually is perhaps more effective in conveying what was at stake in Babbage's time. One can imagine the impact a thing like that would have. I mean, given the fact it's remarkable to us now looking at that machine, one can imagine what it would be like in the 19th century for somebody who'd never seen anything other than a clock or a railway engine or a textile machine to be confronted with something that looks like nothing like either of those things with that degree of intricacy. Right, I'll now pick up where I left off about pulse shaping, about the digitization. The question of the machine being decimal digital team. Discrete values are only legitimate and valid values. Now we can see, right, we can see here, one of Babbage's earliest attempts, this is an 1820s design, where Babbage is attempting, if you like, to digitize. This is a sprung lever with a roller on it. And the idea is that as the wheel advances, when it passes a threshold, which is the apex there, it will flip into the next state because of the spring-loaded value. Now, okay, the dwell angle on the top of that semicircular thing does not define the threshold very clearly. In fact, there's an angle during which the thing does not flip. But you can see the beginnings of an idea of actually how to produce a mechanical flip-flop. This lever also locks, so it actually prevents this wheel being deranged at times where it is not being used, and that is a technique that's used throughout. It's a kind of immunity to. Now, that's the 1820s design. In 1840s, he used a totally different technique, and this is a system of locks which performs the action of pulse shaping, which is, in modern terms, squaring up the edges of a square wave to prevent progressive degradation, which is precisely the effect that Babbage is trying to counteract. We see here, that's a figure wheel, which is a bunch of, which is a standard gear wheel. And you can see a thing with, so that's a plan view. So if you imagine that as looking down on a column of wheels, there's a thing that's like a sword blade over there with a wedge shape in it, which actually enters and withdraws every so often. Now the effect of that wedge is if there's a slight derangement of the figure wheel, it acts as self-correcting. The wedge enters and then recorrects it. Now that is a correction against wear, against vibration through, derangement through vibration, or actual derangement, or physical deliberate derangement. Now here's that once the wedge can enter, it will actually ensure and correct and ensure that the wheel occupies only a discrete digit position. The wedge also performs another function, which is to lock this wheel to prevent derangement during periods which it's in a position to receive new information, either from below from a carrier, from the side from an addition. That it's sitting in free space, it is free to move, and it is locked during periods of the cycle where it will be vulnerable to derangement when it's either not receiving information, when it is not a part of the cycle where it would expect to receive any new information. Now what I can do is show you actually how these locks work in real life. This is a rather simplistic, I need to go back there. Okay, this is a lock going in, and that's one of the sets of pinions. You can see a rack at the back. And what it's doing is checking at various parts of the cycle that wheel has not deranged. Now that lock runs all the way up the column. Each column has its own lock. Now, what happens if this wheel deranges by more than 2 1/4 degrees? The lock will actually jam at the end of the tooth. It will actually fail to enter the gap between the teeth. And that is an indicator that this wheel is in indeterminate position and that the machine has actually got itself into an undefined state. So jamming, frustrating as it is actually a form of error detection. These locks perform a fundamental test. And Babbage boasts, he said, the machine will jam, it will break, but it will never deceive. And he actually challenges you to walk up to the machine while it is operating and attempt by hand to derange the wheels. And he defies you to do this. In fact, he was wrong. You can't derange the wheels, but there's another way of actually messing the machine up, which he did on this plane. But okay, you could put a screen up. But the principle was that he incorporated security devices, and no other machine, including the Schweitz engine, which was susceptible to derangement and all sorts of other difficulties, had that. And it could be that had the machine been completed and the security devices effective, then you would have had the unerring certainty of mechanism, unerring certainty of mechanical agent, which was the great promise of these machines. And there are other examples. These locks are used throughout the machine in different ways. This is the, this one, if you can catch it, you can actually see some pulse shaping happening. Now if you watch this one, as the lock enters, it actually corrects. Keep watching that one. I think it's that one. I think it's this one. As you can see, as the lock enters, if there's a slight derangement or it's slightly not true, it will be corrected. And that is happening every cycle. It happens several times every cycle. You can see the slight shifting as the lock enters. Now there you can see that the threshold is absolutely defined because these are triangular teeth. In the case of the hemispherical ones, you had a dual angle which actually prevented that happening. So that's pulse shaping and locking. Okay, the next thing we can look at is binary latching and polling. Okay. Babbage talks about registers, that is, columns of figure wheels, up to 20 figures in his 80-20s designs. It went up to 26 figures, then it went up to 30 figures in the difference engine 2. His analytical engine has registers of 50 digits, 50 columns high, with 100-digit double precision results. Now, the way he managed to do this is to use what he called successive carry mechanism. That is to say, if you had 999, the worst case is when you have 99999 and you add 1, and you have to propagate the carry all the way through the register. And they didn't have the materials or the mechanisms to do that with. What Babbage does is he separates the carriage, that is any given digit going above 10, from the act of incrementing the next decade. So he separates the two out. So the first thing you do is do a huge addition, and you just record, did a wheel go beyond 10? You don't take any action on it except to produce a one-digit memory. So there's a device on every wheel which actually records whether a wheel goes beyond 10. And all it does is remember that you must now, there's a legacy from the last calculation in which you must now increment the next decade by 1. And we can see how that works. So that's the figure wheel. When it turns beyond 10, that lever flips that curved thing, which flips this lever into a different state. Those are the polling things. Anyway, we'll see how that works. Yeah. That's not what I need. Right, so that's the figure wheel turning, being added to. That's a spring-loaded device there, it jumps to the next indent. If it's set, as that sweeps around, it intersects with it if it's worn and not if it isn't. So you've got a single-digit latch, which remembers the last cycle is an addition required. These then poll, it interrogates each decade in turn, and if the device needs a carry, then the intersection of the two loci actually increments the Okay, we can see this operate live, and it happens quite quickly, that action. If you watch this one, you can see it's set and then carry. That's reset to 0, there it's set and carry. So that's the speed at which it's doing, and it ripples up each thing. You can produce secondary carries, that is carries that are introduced by other carries, so cases of secondary carries. Okay? Right, that is the engine as it stood in 1991. The huge apparatus that we have, which is what I'll now talk about, is the stereotyping, the printing of stereotype. Integral to the concept of Babbage's engines was the fact it wouldn't just calculate in a way that was immune from error, but it would also print the result and also stereotype the result on printing plates so you could actually automatically reproduce to eliminate errors of transcription and of typesetting. So that the original designs incorporate this apparatus in the original conception of the machine. That's the machine. And that's the section that's been added since. So that's the printing and stereotype apparatus. And we'll look at that more closely now. So that's the machine, that's the area we're looking at now. That's a plan of the machine. That's the printing area. It prints in two fonts simultaneously, a large font and a small font. And these things that look like carriage railway lines are in fact tapered push rods, which narrow from a large font to a small font. So they're 30 digits across there, they're 30 digits across there. I'm not suggesting for a moment we actually explain what's going on here. That's an elevation, that's the paper, that's the inking mechanism. You can see that these things are suspended without any visible means of support. Now, if we built this engine being true absolutely to Babbage, and we'd made these, the ink bath and the ink rollers, and we held them up in space, because that's how Babbage portrays them, they would have fallen down. I think we're fairly sure about that. So we had a dilemma, like to what extent actually do we adhere to Babbage's original designs, like suspend these in space, or actually modify the designs to provide the drives. Now, we don't know why he left that undetailed, whether it was obvious or whether the drawing is just incomplete, but that was kind of one of the kinds of judgments we had to make, as to what extent do we preserve the integrity of the original designs, to what extent do we modify it, to the extent that we know it will work. So that's the elevation. These are the stereotype rollers. Those are 30-digit punches with 10 digits around the perimeter. Those are the small ones, those are the large ones, and they are lowered each time to impress results in soft material in these trays over here. And we'll see videos and simulations of how that happens. Okay, so the first thing is, how do you get the result from the last column of the machine, the digit wheel on the machine, to the print wheel, which is in a different plane? And how that is done is through a linkage of racks, of pinions, of spindles, and a vertical rack. So that rotates in a horizontal plane, and that rotates in a vertical plane, and that is a print wheel. It's got 10 numbers there. Those are the column of 30 wheels, and that's the print. And now we'll watch it operate. So as the number, the engine, which is on the right here, drives that column, it produces the wheels. This is how it takes an impression in the printing method. That's a print roll. It automatically, that's an inking bath, transfer roller, and inking rollers. Each time it produces an ink. So it then resets to 0. We'll take the new results. We'll ink the latest result. We'll take an impression. The act of the sweeping out advances the paper automatically, increments the paper advance to present a new piece of paper. And so that's how the printing method. Now that is for record only. It's perfectly clear. You would have to run the machine, if you want 10 copies, you would run the machine 10 times. So this is just for record purposes. You tear that off and that's your record. And what the machine also does is stereotype the results. That produces impressions in soft material, whether that's cardboard or plaster of Paris. And here we have an example of that. These are the stereotype punches, which are lower 2 degrees of freedom, rotational and vertical, and it impresses the results into soft material. In this case, we use plaster of Paris. And you can see it prints the two simultaneously. There is no overhead. The printing is done, there's no buffering and there's no overhead. The result is taken directly from the output of the machine and is printed in real time in parallel with the next computation. And it doesn't extend the calculating cycle at all. Printing does not extend the calculating cycle at all. There's the printing apparatus and the stereotype apparatus working together. So we don't need to decode those drawings. We now have the wonders of 3D Studio. We can now see that run live. Don't know what happened there. Let's go back and see if we can get that clip to run. Okay, so the way the information is formatted on the page is that it's, you've effectively got an XY plotter, which is the tray which receives the results. So it positions itself to receive each new result. So right now we're looking at the printing, so that is the thing sweeping up. And it takes an impression. You can watch the inking roller. Okay, that's the ink bath. These are the transfer rollers and the inking rollers. They're automatically advanced with each result. And they move very slowly. There's an eccentric cam over there, which will be operated by hand now. But that's being printed. You can see it sliding backwards and forwards. So actually it's a spreader. So that if you get a blank line here, it doesn't actually perpetuate through the whole table. It actually spreads the thing laterally. You can see the inking roller, the clearance is actually very tight. The timing cycle is very, very tight. You can see the inking roller come down. It's got to get out of the way very fast. And that's new. So it resets to 0, takes on a new result, inks, takes an impression, and gets out of the way. And so that's how it keeps going.
Did you think all this encoded by yourself?
Pardon?
Did you think all this encoded by yourself?
You had the help of a very good engineer, Joseph Clement. But the fundamental conception was his. Yeah. You can see that the argument of this is a 7th order polynomial with 131, 132, the next should be 133. So we're actually tabulating both the argument and the result in one thing. We saved having to do a second run, which is possibly why there were so many digits on the machine to begin with. These are experimental. The inking now is much better. Okay, that's enough of that. You can see that you can program the format by altering the control of the tray. Here we have a gap of 5, so it leaves a gap every 5 lines. The stereotype punches come down, the trays move on. These move on different line heights. They move at different rates, and the machine automatically, okay, that's line-to-line printing with automatic column wrap. The operator just kept turning the handle there. It took no action of the operator to actually reposition the tray to take the next result. And you can program you program the printer to print in various formats. You can change the number of columns from 1, 2, 3, or 4. 1, 2, 3, or 4. You can change the line heights. You can change the number of gaps between lines, the width of the margins, and you can program it to print line for line with automatically column wrap that you've seen there, or print column to column and automatically line wrap. You can see how. Right, that's line to line with automatic column wrap. That's column to column with automatic line wrap. And you just program that ahead of time, and as you crank the handle, the printer actually automatically looks after that. Okay, we've seen the way the printer works, we now look at the way the stereotyping works. The trays are driven by these falling weights, and the weights are automatically wound up at the end of the cycle. And we'll get to the end of the page here, and you'll see that the tray winds itself back automatically right at the beginning to set itself up for a new column. So each cycle advances the tray one. And now you can see these wheels here. We'll come back to those. Over here you can see the stereotype punches. These are things that are lowered into the tray each time. There's no material in there, only there's some soft material. These punches, you can see another example of the locks operating there. These sliding things with wedges on them, which grip the and prevent them deranging while it's printing. They also locate them to make sure the topography is correct. So these are huge forces involved. These things are lowering into the tray. It's printing the same result. Normally those would turn and take up a new result each cycle. Now it's going to wind itself all the way back. The tray has got the end of the page. The operator keeps turning the handle. It knows it's got the end of the page. It shifts itself over to reposition it, and then tracks the whole tray back and repositions itself to start a new column. Now all that's completely automatic, done by this CAM system. Right, I mentioned that thing was programmable. You can change line heights, you can arrange it to leave gaps every 5, 10, whatever lines. And the way that's done is through pattern wheels, which are these wheels over here. Now the factory issue version comes with 4 separate permutations, but you can put actually any pattern wheel you like on there, and we'll just actually have a look at that. That's one of the stereotype punches. That's experimental stereotype impressions on plaster of Paris. These are some of the tablets we've produced using the machine.
Wet plaster.
It's halfway between. It's actually, you have to catch it on its drying trajectory. If it's too soft, it guns up on things. If it's too stiff, it flakes.
Just a few minutes.
Yes, we believe there are probably 3 people working on that. To keep this machine running for 8 hours, you would actually probably need 3 people phasing the preparation ahead of time of the various trays. We did some curious experiments with it. Also, how to prevent the plaster from sticking to the thing. We used some oils to prevent that.
Are you sure that was what Babbage used? Because at one stage you've got no idea, haven't you?
Yes, Babbage talks about using copper, lead, and he's got examples of copper sheets that have been impressed by one of his things. He also talks about using soaked cardboard, softening cardboard. He talks about using plaster of Paris, and they experiment with various other materials. We found that the forces exerted by the stereotype punches were unable to make any impression on lead at all. And there's an interesting subtle study which I was doing, which is to say, actually, to what extent did you know about the Scheutz's machine? Because the Scheutz's machine cuts into cardboard very deeply. and it's got a completely different method of actually depressing the stereotype punches. And it turns out that Babbage did not know about Scheutz's techniques. Scheutz were printers, and he had patents in printing. Babbage was, in a sense, a novice in this respect. And even his lathe machine does not exert enough force to produce any impression on metal. We've had to use parts from Paris. Cardboard just produced barely an impression, probably insufficient to produce a molded plate from. But those are materials he specifically mentions he did try. These are the pattern wheels. Now you can see there that the tray moves one increment for each line, and the amount by which it moves is determined by the pitch of these wheels. So the line height is determined by the separation of those teeth. Now you can see up there's a gap. That's where the gap in 5. So every 5 there's one that misses a tooth, and that's what actually allows the tray to move on one and skip a line. So you can actually design, depending on what format you want, you can design a pattern wheel, take the front plate or put a new pattern wheel on, and it will follow that pattern. And the way you select the pattern is you just undo that screw and shift this pawl to put those pawls on the appropriate pattern wheel that you want. Now you can see that the line height is actually quite short, so the pitch of these teeth is quite narrow. If we then look at the next one, that is the, we call it for the column, and you can see that the pitch of the teeth is huge, because that's a column jump to shift the tray. So the XY movement of the tray is determined by the pitch of 2 sets of pattern wheels, and that's how the programmability is done. And that is set up ahead of time. You just turn the handle, and the printer then produces the format that you had originally designed, and that's all before Office works.
I can see that the line shift works fine for just plunking down
Yes.
or missing one,
Yes.
but I got the impression that the flyback time, as it were, to move to a different part of the tray was going to be rather long compared with the difference calculating time.
Yes, I think that the particular clip we saw is a tiny bit deceptive. And because I was there with the camera on the first time we used that, the operator wasn't that experienced. What happens is, when you suddenly get the additional shock load of winding the tray back, the handle suddenly stiffens, and he stopped. And I actually had to cut a piece out. If you actually keep the thing moving routinely, the rewind of the tray fits into the calculating cycle.
Good grief.
That was a bit, I don't know if there was a jump cut where we actually took out the pause, because he didn't know what had happened, and the operators are very sensitized. Anything going wrong, you stop, because the danger you'd strip the machine. So in fact, that was an unrepresented thing. He was very, very wary. I don't know if you noticed that the rhythm of the thing dropped the moment that tray, because there's suddenly an additional load. And when you've operated the machine, you become very sensitive actually to whether something's changed. But yes, it does fit in. The rewind of the tray does fit into the timing cycle.
It's a risk design then.
If anyone wants to know how the machine is built, that's a book that was written, published in 2000, which tells 2/3 of the book is Babbage's attempts to build his engines. The last third of the book is the story up to 1991 of how the machine was built here. But the main reason for putting this here at all is that there's practically nothing published on the techniques and technology and the principles of the difference engine number 2. Just to say, there's a new book out edited by Martin Campbell-Kelly and others, and Martin's right here. And this is just out. And in it, it's a book, probably the only book devoted to the history of mathematical tables. And just to say, in it, there is an article called The Unerring Certainty of Mechanical Agency, Machines and Table Making in the 19th Century. And in it, there is probably the first overview, technical overview of the difference engine, of difference engine 2, including examples of the printers and stills from those simulations. So for the first time, if you like, in the public domain, there is something one can go to and say, actually, that is an overview. It's probably no more than 2,000 words devoted to the engine, but there are the primary drawings, 2 primary drawings there, and there are details of the printing stereotype apparatus and the principles of the machine. So just say that's out, and there is new material there on the history of table making.
Doron, seeing that picture of the table, did he actually include zero suppression?
Short answer, that's a very good question, and that's one of the the answer to that question is something I use as an example of what the value of doing the stuff is. It turns out, in order to suppress leading zeros, you'd have to remove figure wheels from the shaft. So you'd have to take the stereotype things off, put dummy wheels in, which had no wheels on to suppress leading zeros. The problem with that is, when you get a carryover, you have to do a calculation ahead of time to know how many leading zeros you need, because when you get a spillover to the nearest next digit you need, you then have to take the thing apart, put a new wheel on. It's perfectly clear from the design this was not intended. And the answer to that is that what he would have done is done what Scheutz did, in that print all 30 digit, and then scalpel off or machine off the leading zeros once you've made the plate. That is how Schweitz did it. And you can actually see the scalpeled holes where they just put all the leading zeros and then scalpel them out. When you know exactly where they're supposed to be, then you can cater for spillovers of the next significant digit. So, I mean, that was one interesting conclusion we could come to from the construction, from trying to use it, that it clearly was not intended that he would suppress leading zeros. So much for, I can see there's a sort of terrible stultification going on, flogging through this detail. So much for the fine detail of Babbage. That's as far as we've got. The machine, the printing and stereotype apparatus worked for the first time March last year. The total project time was from 1985. It took 16 years. We didn't work 16 years full time. Most of the time was spent on something called politics. There was actually probably 3 years of technical work involved in the whole thing, and a lot of money. But the actual saga of the whole thing was spread over 16 years, and the calculator section finished 91, and the rest of it was finished 2002. It is still being refined. We're using scrapers, we're experimenting with different inks. We're for the first time in a position to say, actually, how practical is this machine? Would Babbage have used it? And I know there are skeptics, of which Morris Wilks is the most distinguished of them, saying that actually the whole idea of difference engine was actually a pretty bad idea. And our experiences so far with this machine confirm the original skepticism that Professor Wilks and Professor Morris Wilks actually expressed. And he was one of the first actually to say this what was then a heinous calumny, that Babbage wasn't this extraordinary genius and these machines would work wonderfully well. In fact, the evidence is that these things were actually a monumental monster to use, that you were fiddling around with them all the time. And which brings us neatly back to the question of to what extent was Babbage justified, to what extent are historians justified in portraying Babbage as this sort of genius who was surrounded and failed because of the stupidity of others. So that's the update on Difference Engine 2. And we'll now go back to Babbage's historical image, and we'll look at the role of errors. And I will do this in a summary form because the actual arguments are quite extensive and quite gruesome. Right, one of the main villains of Babbage's piece is George Babbage, Astronomer Royal. And Babbage made a public accusation in 1852 that Airy was motivated by malice, by professional jealousy, and advised governments against the engines because of a personal grudge. Now, there is absolutely no question. Now, there is no published biography of George Babbage. In fact, very little, extraordinary, because he was the most dominant civil scientist of his day. He dominated civil science from 1835 for the next 46 years. He held the most exalted position in science as Astronomer Royal. He was far from a nonentity. He was a rising star. He was a brilliant, brilliant student. His results were so good that when his name was put up on the board at Cambridge for the final, for the tri-pass, his name was 2 lines above the nearest one, indicating he got twice the number of marks. The Senate House was brought to a standstill when he was awarded his degree because of the applause. They had to stop the proceedings. This was a brilliant star. This was not some Salieri playing, this was not someone playing Salieri to Babbage's Mozart. So the idea that he was a mediocrity, the idea that he was actually some nonentity who through personal jealousy was using a massively influential position as scientific advisor to government to thwart Babbage just doesn't hold up. This was the most eminent consultant engineer of his day. He was not only an astute careerist, he did not come from a wealthy family, so he was one of the first civil scientists. He did more to professionalize science through his services to government, through the countless royal commissions he sat on. This was a highly distinguished scientist who was a monumental figure in his day. The fact that there is no biography that people can go to actually confirm this is a lapse which needs to be remedied. But the absence of a biography has allowed people to quote and requote the single one-line dismissal that Airy always used, that people always use of Airy. And that is, when consulted by the Chancellor in 1842, he advised Goulburn that the engines were useless. This offhand dismissal is quoted and requoted as it were to reinforce the notion of Airy as an unimaginative bureaucrat. This is where it says, if somebody could dismiss the lifetime work of a genius like Babbage, this clearly was a man with no imagination, is the subtext of the argument. Now what I've done is actually excavate everything I could find in archives about Airy's involvement in acting as an arbiter of utility for the engines. And that's what we'll turn to now. Airy was in fact consulted 4 times by government to produce reports to give his views on the utility of calculating engines. He was also petitioned by private inventors. One was Thomas Fowler, and the other one was William Bell, for endorsements and professional views on new invented devices, calculating devices that they had come up with. And it's in this correspondence that Babbage actually, that Airy articulates what was a consistent and enduring rejection for decades of the utility of the machines. He advised Goldwyn in 1842, the sooner the machine was abandoned, the better. It was a total waste of time. So this is the most eminent engineer of the day, advising government officially that the engines were useless. This was after the government spent the equivalent of £90 million on them. Babbage was convinced that Airy counselled against the engines and was opposed to the advocacy of the engines because of a personal grudge, which is a fantastically complex and wonderfully entertaining idea to do with a court case about the Troughton and Sims telescope. That Airy was in fact biased against it because Babbage acted as an expert witness in favour of James South, this lunatic maverick, who was suing Troughton for a defective telescope. And so the opposition, in Babbage's mind, it was like a conspiracy theory that Airy, who acted and advised on Troughton's behalf, actually had it in for him. And this he made a public allegation, did himself a huge amount of discredit. The question is, to what extent were Airy's views the result of prejudice, to what extent were they well-founded, or at least to what extent did he articulate technical grounds for his consistent rejection of the utility of machines? And the answer is, he had very good grounds for them, or rather, he had articulate grounds. If the root of his opposition was prejudice, his opposition was technically informed. There's no question about that. So he was consulted in 1841 by Thomas Fowler's calculator. This is a three-state, ternary state calculator using sliding rods, which is very interesting, made out of wood, which sort of completely scuppers the idea that you needed the best of British engineering. You needed the highest precision possible to make things work. He made it out of wood with sliding rods. It was digital in the light of what happened, vastly more promising than in Babbage's engines, and no funding was given because of the bad experience government had. That's a digression. He was consulted 3 times by government. He was consulted on the Scheutz engine, and he produced a very, very detailed report for the application of the Scheutz engine in the General Register Office, at the Greenwich Royal Observatory, and also the Nautical Almanac Office. So he did a comparative study, if you like, and asked independent people, supposedly independent, as far as that people are independent, as to whether they would use these machines, what the utility would be, and what value these machines would have to them in relation to conventional manual techniques. Without exception, they condemned the machines. Without exception, they said, never in 50 years we would ever have a need for these machines. Now, Airy was not alone in this. Niels Seelander in Sweden said that the major canons, tabular canons of logarithms, trigonometric functions, and so on, had already been calculated. There was no need for these machines, and these tables were sufficiently accurate. Leverrier in France did detailed tests on the Scheutz engine, came to the conclusion that a manual calculator, a human being doing the calculation, and using 2 independently computed results, which you then compare, would outstrip the machine both in speed, and the machine offered no additional precision or accuracy or reliability. George Stokes in England, who evaluated the Scheutz machine, came to the same conclusion. He said it's very pretty, but it's probably impractical. So you have not just Airy, even if Airy was prejudiced, you have independent experts in England and on the continent uniformly rejecting the utility of the engine. So the idea that these people were non-entities, these people were motivated by prejudice and watchful, is not sustainable. It's not sustainable. What you have is a visionary, Babbage, Francis Bailey, Lardner, looking at what might yet be done. And you're looking at pragmatists like Airy and his compatriots looking at how would it improve what was already being done. And you have a classic opposition between visionaries and pragmatists. But the idea that Airy could be dismissed as an unimaginative bureaucrat is just not sustainable. Airy also expressed his views in private, and these were reported to Babbage in a document. William McGready, the actor's diaries, are absolutely fantastic source of social gossip and who's doing what to whom. And he says that Airy had said in private that the engine was a humbug. Romney Robinson, an Irish astronomer, said that Airy had said in public to him and Beaufort that the engines were useless. And the Scheutz, Airy actually volunteered an unsolicited view to the editors of a journal in response to George Stokes, where he said that that basically the people who were advocating these engines knew very little about computational need. They were motivated because they were entrepreneurs and obsessed by the detail and the logic of the mechanics of it. They were saying that the motives were not practical and utilitarian, and actually sort of very disdainfully points out the 4 major steps in tabulation that these guys should know about before they started advocating people spending lots of money on engines. So these are the unsolicited views. So Airy's opposition was known quite early in 1837. That was after the project had collapsed, but so he was unable to influence it, but he did influence the government. He had a defining influence in the government abandoning the project. Okay, what was Airy's case? And this is, we can begin to wrap up. What was Airy's case against these devices? So each of those 6 episodes are case studies which have been examined in gruesome detail. And these are the results of the views that Airy articulated in there as to his opposition to these engines. Firstly, the difference engines are not general purpose. They're specialized machines that can only do methods of finite differences for polynomials. He was not telling us anything new here, but what he was doing is correcting a public perception that these were general purpose calculators. So this is Airy writing to Goldburn saying there is a misconception afoot there that these engines are for general purpose computation. His next argument was, and this was shared by others, that there was no need for these machines. Firstly, manual methods were accurate enough, and this was the method of double computation using 2 independent computers and then doing comparisons. Second thing, that there was a negligent demand for new tables. He had done a survey, he had looked at the Greenwich Royal Observatory and said how frequently in the last 100 years we would ever used these for the daily practices of the observatory, and he said once in 50 years. The Nautical Almanac said the same, and the General Register office said no, we need the machine. He said there was no economic advantage, and this is an argument that's an interesting one. He said if you take the capital sum required to complete these machines, invest it, and pay human computers from the interest, you would actually get no worse a result and vastly cheaper. And this was a major argument. He then accused Babbage when this view was expressed of being irrationally defensive of his machine, and he said that Babbage was so sensitive, people actually refrained from mentioning the engines in Babbage's presence, because Babbage was so hot-headed in his defense of the machines. So he was saying there was no economic advantage, which is a very serious argument. His argument also was that the reliability was dependent on manual starting values. That is to say, your initial values set up are required by hand. Also, whether the polynomial, whether the last figure accuracy can be relied on depends on a very elaborate calculation you do ahead of time to ensure that the polynomial approximation to the regular function actually stays within limits. Now, the machine doesn't know that. The machine will calculate that approximation correctly, even if the correctly calculated approximation deviates from the true value. And there's a massive overhead in doing that calculation. George Wilkins, former superintendent of the Nautical Almanac, has done experiments on the machine on bridging differences and what overhead you need in the prior calculations that you need. And it's massive. And so whatever skepticism was voiced about the practicality of these machines actually was articulated by Airy in his day. Finally, his argument that the demand was led by mechanism properties, not by computation, that these people didn't actually understand the fundamental processes, they understood the mathematics, but not the practicalities of the stepwise algorithms and the stages involved in tables production. That's probably quite a harsh criticism, because I think they did understand it better than Airy. Okay, that's the negative values for engines. His arguments against calculating devices, okay, he does have some positive things to say. They're a bit concessionary. There's the value of experimenting through field use. He was getting quite tired of the continuing dispute about the engine debates, and he said actually you could resolve this by field use. This was in response to the Schweitzer engine. Should the Treasury pay £1,600 to build a replica of the Schweitzer engine? And Airy was asked to comment. And he was saying there is some value in actually doing this, even if it didn't work, because of the value. Second thing, that response to public interest. These were issues of huge public interest. There was massive public funding going. Babbage was pilloried about profiteering, which was not the case. He was very sensitive to this. But it was a huge public, there was a huge public interest, and there was some value in actually building the Schweitzer engine and exercising it in order to discharge whatever outstanding disputes there were about it. Finally, this was a fundamental thing, error checking existing tables by differencing. This Professor Sir Maurice Wilkes has actually pointed out that Babbage may have missed the trick here. Nowhere does Babbage ever say that the value of the engines may be to put existing known tables in, differencing them to find results, which is a technique that is well known. And Professor Sir Maurice Wilkes was actually one of the first to point out that Babbage seems to be at the blind spot here. I've done some work on this and found that actually the technique of differencing seems to be, was not last-sighted. Well, it was continuously used from the 18th century all the way through. And that Airy actually specifically mentions it. He says one of the real values of the engines may be not the generation of new tables by finite difference integration, but actually the error checking of existing tables by systematic differencing. And this is explicit, and he gets very excited about the prospect of this at a time after decades of routine opposition to the machines. Finally, when he looked at, there was this, the only time he expressed any enthusiasm for engines at all is after he examined the Schweitzer engine in 1859, and he suddenly saw that you could take decimal astronomical tables and automatically use the machine to produce, produce automatic sexagesimal tabulation suitable for astronomy. And you could just do that by changing the number of teeth on the wheels. And he writes very enthusiastically to Gravitt and the other engineer, saying how much would it cost, how much would it do, and Gravitt writes back and says you can already do it. And from that point on, that's the end of the story, because Airy never gets involved again. They never used, by that stage, 1859, the table debates, the engine debates were finished, and Airy appears to take no further part, except that his files do contain subsequent developments, the Grant machine and various other machines, and that's difficult to know whether these were just filed on his behalf or whether he maintained an interest. But at least in public terms, in terms of the politics of building these engines, Airy played no further role. Airy's objection to calculating devices is different. His measure all the time was the benchmark of precision and convenience was the slide rule, and the practices at the Royal Greenwich Observatory. Now, the moment you say the practices of the Royal Greenwich Observatory are not indicative and representative of great mathematical value, then you scupper Airy's arguments. But his argument was the practical utility for the Greenwich Observatory, and the benchmark was the slide rule. He said, firstly, the operation, that's in relation to the Bell calculator, which was a floating point multiplier, and the Fowler calculator, which was a three-state ternary logic calculator. He said the operation was too complicated compared to the slide rule. Secondly, that the training for general use was impractical. He was a great systematist, and he trained his staff to do particular operations that had to pass exams that would allow them to show they had mastered certain elements of the slide rule. And he said that the training for general use was impractical. He couldn't do this with these calculators, with these clocks. And finally, there was no improvement in accuracy. Unless it was more accurate than the slide rule, then he wasn't interested. And those were his arguments against. Okay, so that's Airy's case. Okay, there's a long bit about errors. Let me see if I can do it quite quickly. The second piece I isolated was the role of errors. Now, almost every account you pick up of Babbage's story, you will find that that it was errors in mathematical production of mathematical tables that was the primary motive for Babbage building his machines. And there are two reasons why we think that. The question, where does that perception come? There are two things. One is the vignette of Babbage and Herschel sitting in 1821, and Babbage clasped his hand to his head and said, I wish to God these calculations were executed by steam. And the idea is, okay, that was the jumping off point, and that's not disputed. But the idea is that, why was that the enduring motive? And the answer is it wasn't. The second thing is Lardner's article of 1834, where Lardner takes a random selection of 40 volumes of tables, he looks at the published errata sheets, and he finds 3,700 errors. This is self-incriminating. Once a publisher publishes an errata sheet, he says, we know these are errors. And this is a scandalous thing. This is a triumph. This is what I call the tables crisis. Lardner says, tables are generically flawed. And he's saying for every error you find, there are countless other errors which you won't have found. So he's not only saying they're generically flawed, but they're immune to correction, because every error you find, I mean, if you actually follow that argument, every error you find there are 10 other errors. Every error you find there are 10 others. In fact, you wouldn't say it was correct. But the point is, Lardner had a rhetorical reason for actually trying to exaggerate the danger of errors. So those two, the vignette of the fact that Babbage, it was errors in tables that was responsible for Babbage's sudden epiphany about machines as a solution to tabular errors, and Lardner's article. Now, if you look at Lardner's article, it was published in 1834. Babbage's conception of the engine was in 1821. So Lardner's views had absolutely no influence on Babbage. And if you want to know what Babbage's expectations of the engine were, you have to go back to the first 6 months in 1822, when he just finished the first prototype. And when you read what he wrote then, he wrote 6 papers in 6 months, and none of them have anything to do with errors. Errors are mentioned, but they feature alongside other features which are vastly more important to him. And they were primarily, Babbage saw the engine as a new technology of mathematics. He talks about using computation as a systematic method of solution. The roots of a function are when the value of the function goes through 0. Every time you turn the handle, you get the next value of the function. When you get the all-zero state in the last tabular column, you found a root of the equation. So you set the machine up, you turn the handle, and you wait for the all-zero state. You've got Turing. Turing's definitely better than the halting problem. If there are no roots, you keep turning the thing and you never get zero state. If you get a root, the thing halts, rings a bell, and stops. And Babbage talks explicitly, he saw computation as a systematic method of solution for equations. He also talks about being able to compute the value of functions for which there's no analytical law. So Babbage saw the mathematical potential of these machines, and that's actually all he cared about. It was only when he had to justify the engines in order to get resources that the issues of tables arose. And he never actually said that the primary use of these engines was for the production of mathematical tables. It was Lardner who said it. And when you start digging about the circumstance in which Lardner said this, it turns out Lardner earned his living by giving lectures. And the fees he got depended on the number of people he could attract. What happened is Lardner went on a northern tour of the industrial cities in 1834, trying to sell, together with his very famous and well-attended lectures on steam engines, trying to sell lectures on Babbage's engines. And the Mechanics Institutes and the branch of the Royal Society said to him, the material is too difficult, it is too scientific. Because what he'd done is gone and spent time with Babbage, he'd learned Babbage's aspirations for the engine was mathematical, and he needed a rhetorical device to make a story, to dramatize the story. So what he did was, he said, errors are the problem, which is why he had a rhetorical purpose for overemphasizing and dramatizing the extremity of the error problem, in order to create a story that would appeal to audiences. So the centrality of errors in Babbage's motivation is an artifact, actually, of something happened 30 years later by Lardner wanting to make a living out of lecturing. He still couldn't convince the Mechanics Institute's people. So what he did was he promised them lectures on railway engines, and he hijacked the first lecture and gave a lecture on Babbage's engines. And to the surprise of his hosts, it was hugely successful. He then grew this from 3 to 5 lectures and had a fantastically successful day. Over 5,000 people heard his lecture on Babbage's engines. And he writes to Babbage, he said, can you think of a device that I could use rhetorically to sell the story? What about errors? What he then did was took out all Babbage's stuff about mathematics, because it was too difficult. So the legacy we have of why we think errors were so crucially important, and I've been as guilty as anyone of perpetuating this myth, well not a myth, there was a tables crisis to some extent, but when you start unpicking this, you look at the time scale, you find that the actual centrality of errors in Babbage's motive, firstly it was not the enduring motive, it was the jumping off point of the enduring motive. Secondly, Babbage never saw the primary utility of the engine as the practical utility for tables production. The fact he spent most of his life trying to build these engines for table production doesn't help dissuade us, but the point is he never actually defended the engines against his attackers. Why, when Stokes, Cylinder, Leverrier and Airy publicly said these engines are useless for practical purposes, did Babbage say that is not their purpose? He never defended the engines on the grounds of their practical utility, because his actual private views were that actually the value is the visionary value to mathematics. So, what we can conclude from that is that Lardner, in dumbing down the purpose of the engines, actually did Babbage fatal damage, because he forced the engine advocates to defend the engines on grounds that were essentially weak. And Babbage never goes public to dissuade them. Why? The point is he relied on Lardner to revive his fallen fortunes. The project had collapsed. Here is Lardner saying, I need material. I will publicize your machines. I will revive your fallen fortunes by explaining to the world why they need to come back and finish these engines. And he had a pact with Babbage, that Babbage would use his influence with the government to actually create a market for Babbage, for Lardner's lectures on the continent and in England. And that is a very clear kind of pact. It's quite an open one, it's not a collusive thing. So, what the conclusion we come to is that Lardner, with the best intentions to serve Babbage's interests, dumbed down the purpose of the engine. In doing so, made them vulnerable to criticism that was impossible to defend against. And we as historians and so on have inherited the story that errors were actually the central purpose. In conclusion, let me say that if you feel after all this that calling these new findings is the shocking truth, if calling them a shocking truth is an exaggeration for the purpose of showmanship in the lecture hall, it may be worth noting that empty dramatization and even distortion is part of a long and distinguished tradition.
Doron, thank you for that. I'm sure there are questions. We've had a few on the way through. But this is your opportunity now to respond to Doron's fascinating talk.
Why did he have so many digits?
It's a very, very good question. It's something that Ivor Grattan Guinness has commented on. He said is mystifying. One was, he was copying the Prony, the great cadastral program in France, which finished in the early years of the 19th century. Calculated logarithms to 25 places and other functions to 33 places. And the purpose of the Prony project, the political purpose, apart from the mathematical purpose, was to monumentalize the French metric system. So they were going to produce a set of tables that were so precise, you would never need anything else. You would always take subsets of these results. But its purpose was political, to monumentalize the metric system. And it could be that Babbage subconsciously actually just mimicked this in order to do better. An engine would have to do better than the Prony in order to prove its merit, its worth. So there have been speculations why. Grattan Guinness says it's mystifying as to why, possibly because he was trying to outdo the Prony. Partly there was a legacy, an assumed legacy, that if you could do things mechanically, you did them to far greater precision. I have an additional insight as a result of having built this machine to offer. And that is when you look at how you would actually produce a table, you've got the argument running down the left-hand column, you've got the results running in the body of the text. In order to generate, so you're going to use 30 digits to generate the result. You're going to use anything up to 12, 15 guard digits. That is to make sure that the last digit actually is correct, depending on how these errors accumulate in the lower registers. So, but you could do as little as 5, it depends on how close the total values are. But say you wrote off 5, 10 digits for guard digits to ensure last digit accuracy. You've still got 20, 25 digits left. If you then look at how you actually produce a table, you would use the residual results to produce the body of the result. You would then have to generate as a separate run the argument, the increments of the argument. You would have to run the engine again. You'd have to set the last difference up and increment it just using one difference. What I reckon Babbage was doing, and you saw it in that example printout, is that you can split the machine. You can actually do 2 sets of calculations in the machine. You can prevent carriage at any point on any line along it. So you can set 2 separate polynomials up and split the machine. Now, if you split the bottom part of the machine, you produce the argument, you use the top part of the machine, you're actually just using it as a kind of printer. You're taking the 31 digits and you're saying, I can use those any way I like on the page. When you start saying that, then you're taking off 4 or 5 digits for the arguments. So you're taking 5, 6, 7, 10 digits for the argument. And then you're coming back to within the normal 15, 20 digits, which is what one would say is actually the extremity of engineering precision. So it's actually looking at how you would save a separate run to produce the argument, and you begin to see that you don't need to deploy the full 31 digits to produce the result. There is an overhead for the argument, there's an overhead for guard digits, and that leaves something in the middle.
Right, can I sort of have a supplementary? That is, I thought he got the funding to produce tide tables initially. Now, how many digits would he have needed to produce satisfactory tide tables?
There was no specific tables that were either promised implicitly or explicitly for the original funding. The idea was to produce astronomical tables.
Oh.
The whole idea was for astronomical navigation. That was why the Admiralty was interested, that's why the government funded it. And the argument, the question you asked is one that Cylinder answered, and he said, why do you need this number of digits when you can only measure to 4? What were you applying this precision to if, in fact, you could only use 3 or 4, you only had 3 or 4 digits in precision? And what he was saying, the effort and the money needs to go into practical measurement of getting sextants more accurately and getting, doing something about slide rules, than it is into, than it would be into producing these massively accurate tables, because the existing cannons were already there, known to sufficient precision and accuracy. So there were arguments saying, why do you need this precision even in his own day? But since then, it's actually mystifying. The only additional insight I have is how you would actually deploy how you would apportion the results between the argument, the guard digits, and the several results.
A practical comparison might be work at the National Physical Laboratory after the war, before electronic computers came in, using commercial accounting machines, Burroughs and everything after that, to produce tables by a method of successive differences. I wonder if that was throws in the light on Babbage. Another comment from Airy saying it was too difficult really for most people to understand. Would that have been true in the long run? Because these days 8-year-old school children are issued with laptop computers which enhance their education in all sorts of ways. So things look different from a later perspective.
Yes, I think the question of the material being too difficult was what the hosts at his hosts at the Mechanics Institute were saying about the people who were coming. And this was the great period of self-improvement, where they were encouraging journeymen and artisans to actually participate in the merits and fruits of the great industrial revolution. They were saying you can't get too mathematical here. That was the argument of the Mechanics Institute. And those, you know, they knew their audience. Except for Lardner, who actually was a gifted and very brilliant lecturer, who understood actually how to capture people's attention. On the question of the using commercial machines for differencing, absolutely. Leslie Comrie, 1820s, 1830s, as Wilkes has shown and has explained. This was, when that started happening, there was an article published in Nature called Babbage's Dream Comes True. And Comrie said there was 100 years of dark age between the death of Babbage and the eventual use of differencing using commercial machines. And the lesson that Professor Wilkes indicates from Comrie is don't make machines from scratch. Don't invest in R&D in the construction of machines. Use commercial machines and adapt them.
I think it's true, isn't it, that Babbage did miss a trick, because I don't think he could use them as designed. I mean, you could make a machine, but as designed, it actually couldn't be used.
The short answer is those particular machines couldn't, but it was trivial to actually get them to.
Yes.
But those particular machines could not. But it was Airy who said that the real value of differencing was not integration, but actually active differencing, yes.
There was another point there. You listed the arguments of Airy raised. He did say, I think, in that quoted comment, that he had gone into the matter very thoroughly.
Yes, yes.
Gave his advice. Did you ever find a particular report on that?
This was a major piece of excavation. Airy was absolutely meticulous. It is said that he never lost a piece of paper. And he refers, in the letter that Professor Wilkes refers to, is a letter from Airy to Goulburn in 1842, where he says, I was consulted by the Chancellor and I considered this in great detail and advised him that the engines were useless. Now, for Airy to say that he did this in great detail means he did it in great detail. And there is no other reference to any other document. Now, if the document existed, it would have survived, because Airy was an obsessive about filing. In fact, he had all kinds of filing systems with holes and things for sorting. And he was one of the very early people to use card punches to actually produce patterns of holes that he could retrieve documents. Everything he ever did was file, including his household bills. So, the question is, we can't find the document. That is not conclusive proof that it doesn't exist. So what on earth was going on there? It's not a covering letter saying, I enclose my report on this engine. And there's no other reference to this document. What I've done is, I've gone through Babbage's, Airy's autobiography compiled by his son. Now this has the appearance of a diary, because it is dated by year and even by day as to what happened. Now this diary was compiled from Airy's quires. This was scrap paper which he kept. Airy was absolutely systematic. When you start looking at the dates, there are little hints in the diary, and they're very clear and quite explicit, that the actual diary was not written at the time. The diary was written sometimes up to 30 and 40 years later. Now what I've done is track when Airy was working on which year. And if you follow the sequence, the point at which Airy wrote the entry of 1942 was between 30 and 40 years later. So, Airy is now recalling that he had produced some systematic analysis of the utility of engines. What he did do was produce a systematic analysis of the Schweitz engine in 1857. And my conclusion is, both because one hasn't been found, which isn't conclusive in itself, but that Airy, 40 years later, is actually conflating the detailed report on the Schweitz machine with having studied the situation in detail. And some of his findings are identical. The expressions he uses, not once in 50 years would we ever need these things, are the same as in the letter to Wilkes. My conclusion for that is that there wasn't a report in detail on Babbage's engines, but there was a later one, and in Airy writing 30, 40 years later, in this rather offhand way, had actually confused the two, and said, I've studied this in great detail, and I advised them. So the study was later, but he advised them that they were useless. And that I've documented in quite detail. There are specific instances of the diary and how that time sequence works has been documented in detail. So that was my ultimate conclusion about whether that report existed. The answer was I don't believe there was a contemporary report in 1842 on Babbage's differentiation 1.
I don't want to knock George Airy unduly, especially in the absence of an autobiography, but as far as I can tell from his dates, it was most definitely he who told the engineer Sir Thomas Booch or Bouch that the wind force you could expect in midwinter in Scotland was 10 pounds a square foot, and Booch or Bouch built the Tay Bridge accordingly, probably not very well. A year later it blew down, and a year after that Sir Thomas topped himself.
Yes. There is absolutely no question that Airy had his detractors, and another one was the discovery of Neptune, which has done him irreparable damage. He is still pilloried today, where an Englishman produced the results, very elaborate calculations which show that Neptune was producing, but that there was a planet, an undiscovered planet, which turned out to be Neptune, which was producing perturbations. And he took the results to Airy. Airy failed to use his telescopes to search for the planet, and Leverrier very shortly after discovered it, and this was absolute, he was pilloried and lampooned for decades afterwards. His reputation was very visibly down. As someone who didn't have the imagination to actually use his telescopes to look for a thing, and therefore France got the credit of discovering Neptune rather than England. This was national disgrace, because astrology was even more important then than it is now. And a new planet would mean that one could then know about the affairs of humankind in greater detail than otherwise know. And so
we did have the points for Europe.
What was that?
We did have the points for Europe.
There's no question that Airy has been accused, and the Tay Bridge is one that he is tainted by. The discovery of Neptune is absolutely full frontal. I mean, he was absolutely lambasted by the astronomers, by English politicians and all the rest of it. So yes, I'm not for a moment saying he was a visionary or that he was imaginary, but to dismiss him as an entity or somebody who wasn't competent is not sustainable. South publicly accused him of mismanagement of dereliction of duty at the Greenwich Royal Observatory. So there were people who absolutely, who made very concerted attempts to discredit him. By and large, he defended himself very well. But Neptune was the most damaging episode, and the Tay Bridge is one that sort of, at the time he managed to evade any kind of disgrace, but subsequently I think it has stuck. Perhaps more